On my right here is Jacob Boehme, Boehme? Yeah, am I saying it right? Who is also from Australia, but from completely the other end of it. Jacob hails from Melbourne, and is an Indigenous choreographer and theatre maker. And Gabe Hughes, who's at the end here, is from Canada, already talked about quite a bit this afternoon. She is Wampanoag. She's the first person from the Canadian First Nations to become a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, which is a great achievement, and we salute it. And she's someone who is very steeped in her culture. And it was Gabe who, during the course of one of our email conversations over the last few months, came up with the title of this particular session, What Does It Mean to Be Indigenous Today? And I suppose I'd like to ask you to start, really, by telling us why you thought that was something which it was important to talk about, and what your particular take on it is.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you all for coming here today. So I think the reason I thought of this is because it comes up in my personal life all the time, in my family life, and it comes up in my research quite a bit as well. And just to give you an idea of where I come from, my family is from the Wampanoag Nation on Cape Sable Island. However, we grew up far away from there in Newfoundland, so I actually grew up with the Mi'kmaq Nation. So, and I am a little bit Mi'kmaq, but I'm mostly Wampanoag and Scottish. Culturally speaking, I'm sort of Mi'kmaq, but I'm also affiliated with the Wampanoag Nation. And growing up, we were taught that we were Portuguese because my grandparents were so deeply ashamed of being Aboriginal that they needed to come up with a reason why they were dark-skinned. So they told everyone they're Portuguese. And it wasn't until my grandfather died that we were allowed to know the truth, really, although we had always been raised in this particular context. It was very important to my father, but we couldn't actually come right out and say we're from the Wampanoag Nation. So that's sort of where I come from. What my research is about, I study intellectual property law for the protection of traditional knowledges. And particularly, I look at video games that are being made by Aboriginal communities in Canada and the States. And the video games are based on traditional stories and incorporate traditional songs and various sort of visual elements of traditional culture. But they're in video games. And part of the problem that the law has with this is that the law is very concerned with definitions. It's very, very difficult to define something that is always in the process of changing and growing. So that's a bit of a problem for that. So I thought I would just try to give some context for the Canadian context, I suppose, because I can only speak from my own background. I think a really good example to illustrate part of where this becomes a bit of a problem. There's fantastic Cherokee artist, Jimmy Durham, who I would suggest you all look up. And in 1990, the United States government passed law. There was the 1990 Indian Arts and Crafts Act. And that meant that you could only sell art as a Native American if you were a Native American. So you couldn't sell authentic Native American art unless you were Native American. The problem with that is that it required you to be a government-registered Native American. So only if you were recognized by the government could you sell authentic art as your own culture. And so Jimmy Durham ran into some problems with this because his ancestors had just completely didn't find it necessary at all to prove themselves to the US government. And so he was no longer allowed to actually sell art as a Native American. And sort of this government registration program was really, in Canada and the States, was really part of a larger assimilationist program that sought to stamp out sort of the logo in Canada, at least for the residential schools, for example, was kill the Indian, save the child. So it was really meant to kill any part of Aboriginal culture you had in you. And just to give a sense of what this was, to give a bit of a historical sense of where we're coming from in Canada, a bunch of things sort of happened at once, particularly following the Indian Act in Canada of 1876, in which traditional culture and traditional practices were banned, outright banned, so no more potlatch, no more meeting of the Traditional Council of the Six Nations. Children were being taken from their families, from their homes, and they were being made to, basically, they were made to feel ashamed of who they were. They were heavily abused if they did anything Indian. And this happened for well over 100 years in Canada, with the last residential school only closing less than 20 years ago. At the same time, what was happening was there was this collecting, this like salvage impulse where people were sweeping out all these cultural objects from Native communities from throughout Canada. And the idea was that these cultures were bound to be extinct, because there was no way they could survive in the wake of this wonderful advanced civilization that was coming in and teaching them how to live. So they'd have to collect everything before they disappeared. And the great irony of this, of course, was the more you collected everything and ridded and emptied these communities of their cultural objects, and simultaneously prevented them from creating any more. Meanwhile, these objects were being used to advance pseudoscientific sort of ideas about the evolutionary sort of primitiveness of these people. This was all sort of happening at the same time. And so what you get now is sort of, after this sort of 150-year at least history of an intentional disruption of the natural growth and movement of a culture, people sort of turn around at Aboriginal communities today and say, why aren't you the same? I don't understand. Why are you different? Why have you changed? And the one that I get all the time is like, why are you so white? I don't get it. Which has been a real problem since I've moved to the UK as well. So I think, I hope that provides some amount of context. And to that, I would just sort of like to say, it's to the people who sort of are wanting sort of authenticity from Indigenous communities and expect that authenticity come from this very narrowly defined box. I would like to say that I suppose that it's that you have no right, really, to say that you must stay the same and be the way that we tell you to be, all the while we've had the opportunity to change and grow without fear of losing our authenticity. And I would also like to say that it has always been our tradition to change. It has always been our tradition to innovate. And so the incorporation of new materials, new media, and new modes of expression is something that is traditional. And so I don't know if that's a point where I can leave that just for the discussion of
absolutely.
Contemporary art practices and that sort of thing.
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Because tradition is by nature something which passes on and therefore moves through generations and contexts. It's in the nature of tradition that there is change. That's what passing on is, and the idea that something should somehow be frozen in time. But we actually touched on this last night, didn't we, Patrick? Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you.
Glad you could make it through the wild city, because last night we were in the British Museum, and the Zugabal dancers did this extraordinary performance in the museum, and what was so rich in the dynamic of it was that, of course, the museum has taken things, and this is sort of heading into the next discussion a little bit, but it's in the nature of a museum collection that something is still, because it's in a box. And what was so wonderful with seeing you guys actually employing the masks and the headdresses and the culture was that it was alive. In fact, you don't get much more alive than the dance that you did last night. And I think that reflects very much on what Gabe was saying, isn't it? That actually it's a living practice.
It is a living practice. First of all, before I start, thank you everybody, and apologies for being late. London is much bigger than Thursday Island, so the time. But thank you for inviting me on the panel, and to speak on that, the culture of the Torres Strait is really alive and well, and that's what most people don't realize, is that it's practicing, and this is the reason why we were able to survive for so long, and we're able to, I think being that where it's located, such an isolated place, that would work into our benefit with all, the stuff that happened over in Australia, that we were able to keep that closely with that culture, and that's what we came over to present.
One of the things that's really interesting about you is that you not only work with this very traditional group and in a very traditional way, but you also have hip hop culture, and
yes.
And how do you make that relationship between the hip hop and your indigeneity?
Well, I'll try to tie it in real quickly, because if I could go forever speaking about this, the hip hop culture. What most people don't understand, that it is a cultural art. The art form is actually a culture, and this culture was born out of oppression back in the early 70s, where a group of minorities in an oppressive state in New York City said that we need to get something of our own to be able to move into a positive direction, because this time that we're living in is actually killing us. And they drew in from all these cultures across the world and formed their own culture. And the best way I can explain it, why hip-hop connects so well to a lot of generations, a lot of culture, and in particular indigenous culture, is the fact of its elements. I describe it where the elements of hip-hop is made up of 5 basic elements. And those elements, I think, the uncle that was emceeing yesterday at the British Museum, he touched on that briefly. So those 4 elements, I'll break it down, is the b-boying, the graffiti artist, the MC, and the DJ. If I translate that over to indigenous cultures, our b-boys are our traditional dancers, our MCs are our storytellers, our graffiti artists are those who practice visual arts, and our DJs are our music composers. Now all these 4 elements are there to capture the overstanding element of it all, which is knowledge. The knowledge to be passed on from generation, and this is how hip-hop has survived so long, and this is why indigenous culture has survived so long, because our storytelling through these mediums are able to pass on these for the next generation. All my teachings to this date have been stories that has been passed on through either art, music, storytelling, or dance from those before me. I'd like to acknowledge my uncle who's sitting in this room, artist Ali Tipoti. He has been one of those teachers that has instilled me and guided me through this journey, through his art practice, but also as a mentor, being able to tell me these stories, and this is how the culture survives. And so the similarities of being in hip-hop and the traditional Torres Strait culture, they're one and the same to me, because they feel so well based on these principles.
It's fascinating, because seeing it the other night, from a Westerner's perspective, and I speak as a Westerner with a great interest in indigenous cultures, but I'm not indigenous, I'm never going to be. But what I saw was kind of, it felt very sort of postmodern, I suppose, that there was 2 things which, from an outsider's viewpoint, looked very different, and that you had married them and brought them together and actually created something new by what I perceive to be a clash. But actually you're saying something very different, which is that for you they're absolutely the same in the first place.
They are the same things to me, yes.
That's really, really interesting. And actually makes sense as to how you married it.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's all coming from the same place for you.
It is. And like I said, the whole, throughout the music that I do, it's about passing on those stories and those messages which I have learned from those who have paved the way before me, not only in hip hop but music, art, and my culture.
So Jacob, I'm wondering how this reflects on your practice as well, because you're someone who works both with an extremely strong awareness of tradition, but also very much with an awareness of the contemporary context, and it's how these things mesh together, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm glad. Thank you again, everyone, for being here and for inviting me. Michael knew I was in town, so asked me to come through, and I haven't prepared, so I'm context now. I know what we're yarning about. But yeah, to give you context about me, and I can only speak from my personal perspective, as is Gabe. I am mixed blood, obviously. My father is an Aboriginal man from Narungga and Kaurna tribes of South Australia, also mixed with Finnish blood. My mother comes from English and Irish heritage. So in eugenics terms, that would make me a quarter caste, and I'm the fairest of four siblings, so I'd be removed like that. I didn't grow up on country. Very similar to your story, my grandmother brought up my dad and his siblings to pass themselves off as Indian and Malaysian because of forced removals. My father and his sisters moved to Melbourne when they were 12, 13 and 14 and started work very young, having to take care of themselves. My grandmother did that so that she knew where they were, so that instead of the state taking them, she actually removed them and placed them in care herself so she could continue contact. So my father, that's where my father met my mother. I was born on Wurundjeri country, which is on one side of the river in Melbourne. And then I grew up on Boonwurrung country, which is the other side of the river in the city of Melbourne. So, it was the Boonwurrung elder, Auntie Carolyn, that started me on my journey. I was sent off to dance when I was about 20. We have a Aboriginal Islander dance college called NAISTA. It's been around for 30-something years. There we learned the Western canon of dance, but our main foundation and focus was all in traditional dance. So we had elders, lawmen, lawwomen, songmen, songwomen from all around Australia and the Torres Strait that came and did residencies with us. And that's where I started to learn more about my culture, my belonging through other dance practice, from other cultures' dance practice or other mobs. So for the past 21 years, my practice has been not only in contemporary theatre, but the one thing that I was taught by my elders is that as you move forward, so do your responsibility is to clear the path for the ones behind you. You're constantly moving forward, being very conscious of those behind you. And which is a huge baggage. So if you're an artist, if you're trying to artist, and that's the thing, we don't have a word for art. We don't have a word for artist. It incorporates everything. It's Western culture that's come in and said, well, that's visual, that's dance, that's poetry. It's like, no, we do all them all the time. Well, one doesn't exist without the other.
And even separating it from life, right, is a Western thing. And ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. But this whole thing about, contemporaneity in traditional practice. I mean, I've been taught ceremonies and been part of old ceremonies where, within one song cycle, I'm doing a dance that is 1,000-year-old song, and on the other hand, 5 songs later, I'm doing a dance that is 40 years old because the Tiwi mob, where that ceremony was from, made a story about those Japanese planes coming to bomb Darwin in World War II. So, it continues. And the one thing that I'm doing at the moment is that I'm working with those Kulin mob. That's what there's 5 nations that make up Melbourne, and altogether they make up a confederacy called the Kulin Nation. And for almost 180 years, language, song, dance was not practiced in Melbourne. It was, again, banned. Most people thought that it was lost. But over the last couple of years, we've been working together to bring ceremony and back into Melbourne. And to tap into your next conversation, I was rudely shocked when I went to the British Museum on Wednesday, because I've been working with these elders and communities for about 4 years now for this major project. And there are artefacts in the British Museum. I went straight back onto Skype and to Facebook, being a contemporary black fella. I went and sent messages out to the elders and said, I've just seen your painter in pictures. I've just seen your women's digging sticks with remnants of ochre and feather for ceremony. I've just seen your things that elders just have no idea exist, and I had to travel to London on a pathway to somewhere else. I'm off to Wales to go in and be invited into the British Museum and being smacked in the face with all these artefacts that have no name, no owner. By the way, they have a date when they were found and a region, but no one owned it, no one made it, no one used it. Sorry, I'm raving. Where was I?
No, your raving's very interesting because you're talking about dispossession, aren't you, of culture and the whole question of ownership of culture, which I think is it does touch a little on our next discussion around museums, but it's also a matter to do with having the Indigenous identity right now. Can you reclaim the culture as being your own, or does it have to be in some way? Oh, it's horrible, the thought of sharing it with the coloniser, but actually the coloniser does still share the space.
The problem is that we're still having to define it within the coloniser's framework.
Precisely, yeah, right.
And our traditions have existed and evolved and maintained, even through genocide, even through massacre. They have remained, but yet us contemporary black fellas are having to define ourselves within a framework and within a paradigm and a language that is has no relevance. It's quite simple, that paradigm. Everything's just
Well, but this very much reflects what you were saying at the beginning about there is no right to say you have to stay there, and there's no right to define from outside. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think it's not that. It's not that, for example, my community doesn't want to engage with sort of the Western dialogue. It's that the Western dialogue has been allowed to dominate for too long. And we have to get to the place where we can start sharing. We're not there yet quite because we're not on equal footing yet, and you need to be on equal footing to share. And it's not there yet, but we're starting. We're starting the healing process. I think we're getting to a place where we can start.
And what are the steps by which you see that being possible to happen? I mean, you're clearly suggesting that it is happening, but how is it achievable?
I would hope. I mean, an event like this, I think, would speak to the fact that at least the dialogues are happening. At least there are people listening. I think at the end of the day, it's apologies and listening are very good, but there also must be action. And where that comes from, I think that comes from a place of shared dialogue and a place where we actually seek to understand one another.
And a redistribution of power.
Exactly. Exactly.
Say a bit more about that.
Well, I mean, you've got it right here. You had to take your example here in the UK, you had a cultural leadership program through the British Council that started and only lasted for 3 or 5 years. It was getting too successful.
Was this the one that you were on when I first met you?
No.
No.
You had actually in your Arts Council, you had a cultural leadership
the CLAW program.
Which was getting quite successful and dealing with things about diversity in leadership in the UK. It got way too successful and was making far too much headway. A black woman by the name of Hilary Carty was running that. That's a no-go in this country. You know, a black woman leading something that's successful, let's shut that down because that's going to rock the boat.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, one of the reasons it rocks the boat is because I think there is still a mentality, even in the 21st century, that people want to see the oppressed. They want to see the unsuccessful. And that actually what's current in the culture is the idea of black people being oppressed in some way. And I think that's a very difficult paradigm to break out of because it's all black and white, it's above and below, it's positive and negative.
And I think that's the questions that are being raised back home. I don't know if Brother Boy here and Alec want to yarn about this too, because there's a big debate back home about do we continue to go along the path of our leaders. We've had some fantastic black leaders who have negotiated. Like, basically, if you look at the power structures as a game, we're all in the monopoly board. Yeah, that's the economic structure. That's the way things roll globally. We're playing Monopoly. Yet, us mob, we prefer to play Scrabble, and you can't play Scrabble on a monopoly board. So, do we continue to play Monopoly and learn the system to break the system, or do we fuck the system and go, let's play Scrabble? But then we also, we cut off our, a lot of economic opportunity and livelihood.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, to that, I mean, I was to thought, to change the system, you got to try to work within the system and try to understand the system, but the system is so oppressive. I mean, like, apart from what I do in music, I also work with a job service provider as well. You know, we deal with the welfare over in Australia, which is at a terrible state right now, especially with the new reforms coming in. And I went in there, they put me into a manager's position throughout the whole Torres Straits, believing that I could actually make an impact and change positively in there. But once you get into that system, it's just so much red tape around you where you just are binded by, I really can't do anything right here. Then you got to remove yourself from the system, whereas I had to leave, which just because you cannot make any positive impact, especially for the next generation, working with the powers to be and within this system. You had to see if you could do this from an outside mold. And not to say that what the leaders did before didn't work. They made astounding impacts that, you know, changed the way, paved the way for someone like me to walk through. I mean, I could sit there and talk about Vincent Legari, you know, Eddie Mabo, all those people who stood up head on against the system and changed the world. I mean, someone who I look up to in the Torres Strait, like Eddie Koikimabo, you know, he was one that was there, put it forward for land rights, and, you know, moved and changed that movement. I think over generations, the education about these people and what they did diminished and lost because, you know, we don't speak about it too much, we don't speak about it at all within the systems, and therefore people of my generation and younger than me don't even know about these people.
Eddie Mabo is a really interesting example, actually, because for those who don't know, Eddie Mabo was a Torres Strait Islander who established through a huge court case that there was an indigenous entitlement to land, and there was a legal system of land ownership prior to the invasion by white Europeans, and that was the basis on which all native title is now based, was the Mabo decision. And so what that's about is infiltrating indigenous law into the national framework and creating a real dialogue between legal systems, which touches on your interests, does it not, Gabe?
Which is really interesting because native title now has turned into, and Eddie was, Koiki Eddie Mabo was a true leader in doing that for a lot of people around Australia and the Torres Strait. What has happened though, and this is where the argument I think comes back, is that a lot of black leaders since have gone into that game of native title and now are working the system within the Western system, which it is now structured. So native title means that you, as a dispossessed family, Aboriginal family, must prove 5 generations of continuous connection to the country you were dispossessed from. So native title, for most people, most Aboriginal language groups in Australia, has become very hard to attain, and it just creates more boundary wars and more family wars.
In Canada, for example, we have there's Aboriginal, and then we have 3 subcategories of Aboriginal. So there's the Inuit in the north, then we also have First Nation, which is probably what comes to mind for most people, and then we also have Métis. And Métis, in the government definition, means half and half, but there's actually a very specific Métis culture that developed through sort of the intermarriage of French settlers and the particular Aboriginal groups there. However, just as an example of sort of where definitions get fuzzy, my First Nation is defined as a Métis Nation, even though we don't identify as a Métis Nation. We have nothing to do with the Métis Nation whatsoever. So my status card, we actually have status cards in Canada with a number, so I have a government number to identify me as an Aboriginal woman.
We call them dog tags.
Dog tags. So I am called a Métis, have nothing to do with the Métis. So these exterior definitions do not always work, and often they don't, and usually they're used more as a means to control and to define rather than actually as a means of empowerment.
So you all seem to be saying that every time there's some kind of empowerment or some sense of being able to move on, the colonial system always tries to contain it within that box. I mean, what on earth is the way out?
Is to review that. The key word is the system. The system is I would say it's corrupt. It's just, that's what it is. Categorizing people. Once you categorize people, that means you put them into little boxes where that you could be able to control them and keep them on a leash. It's
begin from the beginning, wherever that is, and the problem we always seem to have is that everything gets absorbed into an existing structure, which is still a colonial structure. Yes?
I think it's important that you mentioned trying to get back to, or at least appreciating where we've all come from. Because one of the biggest problems that we have in Canada, certainly today, is that you have the non-Indigenous community and the Indigenous community, and there's so much overlap between the two that goes unrecognized and creates this environment where there's misunderstanding and mistrust. And part of that is because you don't recognize how people got to where they are today. You don't see that history. You just see, you know, like I said the other day, you just see what the media gives you. You just see, you know, you're given an inaccurate representation of where people are and where they've come from. And so it absolutely has to start with where we've come from and where we want to go. And that's, and negotiating and discussing that now.
You said like you was respond, yeah.
No, just for some reason, we just had an incident in Australia. I don't know if you've heard of the Australian Football League, AFL. We have a star player, Adam Goods, who's actually a Narunga relation of mine. When a footballer kicks a goal, he usually has some kind of, and especially where the goal is where the opposing team's fan squad is, there's usually some kind of showmanship, you know, that, or, you know, chest beating, some kind of Tarzan masculine stuff anyway. Adam Goods, when he kicked his goal, we've had this young under-16 team, that Indigenous football team that has been supported by the AFL. They have created, like almost like the Māori have the haka, they've created their own little kind of war dance that kind of stirs them up before a game. They taught it to Adam Goods. Adam Goods, once he kicked his goal, did that to the opposing fan club, and that created a riot because, and it was all about he threw an imaginary spear at us. It's like, okay. So any kind of expression of culture, I mean, I don't know, any kind of expression of culture that is not approved, that is not watered down, and this goes to talk about theatre practice, that is out of the realm of palatable black theatre for majority white audience, it causes offence and it causes an uproar.
Well, I remember us talking about this when we met before, Jacob, that because you had just, I think, done a cultural performance, and you know it had gone very well, and all the white people had gone, oh yes, very good, aren't they nice, and then gone home, and that what was worrying you was the lack of any deep engagement and actual real exchange, and that the culture had in some sense become packaged.
Well, exactly. I think it appeases non-Indigenous audiences to see cultural or traditional performance or any expression of traditional culture in a I hate to say it, but in that kind of, you know, homogenised performance form, because then it appeases colonial culture. Oh, okay, so they're not dead. We didn't damage them. We didn't fuck them up that much. See, they can still sing and dance. They've still got part of their practice. So it becomes, it's a live museum piece. It's not behind a glass box, but it may as well be, because people sit there, they go, okay, great, I'm feeling cultured now, well done. We don't talk about genocide, we don't talk about massacre, we don't talk about the blood, sweat and tears that goes into uncle here and brother here, sitting with elders, getting back the language when the elders are ready to speak it to us, telling us the stories, which is usually months before they die, because they know they're going, so that's when they feel safe enough to tell us. You know, it doesn't take into, none of you take into account any of that goes on to put that performance on. And that's what most of us have to go through these days, to put on, unless we have had continual connection to country, unless our language and our song and our dance and our culture wasn't raped, wasn't destroyed, then those are the processes we have had to go through to get that performed to you. And usually we have to do that within 10 to 15 minute time frame, and hopefully you'll provide us a explanation so we can put it in a program so people have a context of what they're seeing. You know, I mean, come on, use your brain.
Well, talking of using brains, I'm going to open this out to the audience because I mean there's a lot to talk about. Yes, gentleman at the back, David.
Just to go back on the analogy you used, how are you going to encourage us to play Scrabble rather than Monopoly?
I'm not sure that you're invited yet.
That's enough for me.
I'm actually not sure that you're invited yet. You're welcome, but I think we need to figure out our own rules again. Because I know that, I mean, and I'm not 100%. I mean, I'm saying all this stuff, but I will totally contradict myself because I do live in a society that runs on the Monopoly board. But my theatre practice and all of that kind of stuff, like that's where my research is headed, into Indigenous methodologies, performance methodologies. I've learned from some of the great lawmen and women from around Australia, and we have specific performance methodologies, and they're ceremonial, but they are performance methodologies of the way to make theatre, which is basically what we're doing. Every time we step into four walls within a creative development, we're already within the Western theatrical framework. And so it's like, and yeah, I think there's a whole lot of redefining that we need to do as well. I don't know. What do you need?
It may also begin at a level about caring for. So I mean, I recognize there's a deep admiration for Indigenous culture. However, there's also there can be a problem with that sometimes, where that admiration is only, or it creates a distance, and there's only a care on a very superficial level. And there's a wonderful artist. His name is Edgar Heap of Birds, and I can't remember quite what his artwork is, but what he says is, you don't want us. You want our dances, you want our songs, you want our costumes, you want our culture, but you're not prepared to deal with us, which is, in my community, you know, the songs don't exist in isolation from the issues we have with poverty and alcohol abuse. Those things happen at the same time. And so if we want to engage with one another, we have to do it in a really honest way, where you recognize that there's a very deep history of intergenerational trauma that occurs simultaneously with this beautiful culture as well. And so there has to be caring about that, as well as with the beautiful performative aspects and cultural aspects, or more obviously cultural aspects of our communities, I think.
Do you have any thoughts on this, Patrick?
No, that summed it up really well.
Okay.
Really good.
Another question then. No? Yes, gentleman here. Yeah.
I'm pretty interested, Michael, when you said you're not Indigenous. Because at the moment, I'm hearing things quite so meaningful for me, because I work with the Psalm, with the Bushmen and the Kalahari. And there you've got a system where the Bushmen have been completely, I mean, it's the same story coming out in different ways, but they haven't been forcibly removed and stuck through an educational process in the way that's happened in Canada or Australia or New Zealand. And so you don't have a vocal population. It's only now that people are coming through and they're just starting to, they've been put through university or whatever. And they don't have any of the tools that I'm hearing today. And it's amazing hearing people speaking in the way they're speaking. But I'm just wondering if is there any value in sort of going back, as you said, going way back, opening up the conversation and saying, well, what does it mean to be Indigenous? What you're talking about is a way of appreciating people, feeling, related to your environment in a much more sensitive manner that actually applies to all of us. And are we not again boxing things by saying, well, you're Indigenous, you're not Indigenous?
But the problem is that I'm here speaking as a Narungga Ghana mixed blood man, but my experience is not the experience of my brother nor my sister here, and mostly you want us all to be neatly wrapped up in a package. There's many versions of black. There's many versions of blackness, and we're not all the same. It's like, tell me what it means to be white. you know, because I have a white culture in me, and you know, there are people in my white culture that I would hate to have to align myself with.
But even the terminology is actually problematic because it's a terminology which was generated out of a world which wanted a culture which wanted to think of itself as being pristine. And therefore defined itself as whiteness. I mean, you look around the room, actually nobody in this room is white. One or two people are kind of beige. You know, it's and the moment we start seeing it like that actually it's not even about blackness and whiteness, and because whiteness is sort of an absence of colour, and that's not the point. You know, it's as you say, it's to do with the nuance and the specific, that identity is something which emerges through a historical experience. And so, you know, the difficulty of going back is that then actually you have to work forwards again. Because in fact we are where we are now, and that has happened through a long process of, well, suffering in the case of the Indigenous peoples, yes.
I wouldn't say it's not, I think we still have to acknowledge the colored aspect of that, because it continues to be a problem, and it creates an excuse for racism and racist behavior. Absolutely. So for example, I don't present as Aboriginal, and so I don't have to deal with the Aboriginal racism and real hate that a lot of my family gets, because they do. So we have to acknowledge that still exists, but hopefully we can get to the point where.
You must be like me when, because we're the fair ones in the family, you know, like we're the ones that get sent on the street to hail the cab.
And then everyone else
comes
out.
Stop for us.
That's real, man. I do have a cousin who's like that. That's what we do, because
the same thing happens.
Just don't stop to us, man. They just don't stop. But yeah. So if I may,
go.
That, but just to add another point of view to that concept, like going back and being able to start this conversation from the beginning is not only just so everybody else outside can understand, but our own people be able to go and redefine themselves within their identity. Like for the Torres Straits, I'll speak on that. They call us the Torres Strait Nation, but we are nations within nations. Like we are so diverse within our own nation. The Australia Indigenous population, Indigenous brothers and sisters, there's so much nations, and you have to understand that. You can't box it all in and say this is Indigenous and, you know, and keep us in like that. So we have to have those discussions and be able to redefine that. And it's a starting for the healing, the empowerment of us as a people first, before everybody else can understand. You know, this is for me, I get this all the time when I'm back at home, that I have to always justify or define myself to someone from outside who's non-Indigenous, always questioning about my practices and why I do what I do within my cultural context. And first of all, before I used to antagonize me, I used to get mad about it, but then like, I don't have to justify myself to you. And being able to teach my brothers and sisters after this, my nieces and nephew, to be able to carry that same pride on is why we must go back.
That's a fantastic note to end on. I'm afraid I need to bring this discussion to an end. All of these discussions, I just want to keep them going, but you know, there's a whole series of them. It's been very fascinating and provocative in a very good way to talk to the three of you. And thank you very much, Gabe Hughes, Jacob Boehme, and Mau Power.
Thank you.